right, so hello everyone. I wish we could be together in person, but I'm so glad that you're all here learning about the bill. My name is Adeline DeYoung, and I work in CCL's DC office as the Government Affairs Coordinator. My work focuses on tracking and researching pertinent legislation, meeting with congressional offices and NGOs, and advocating for CCL's policy goals. I've been with Citizens Climate Lobby since starting as an intern at CCL's headquarters in San Diego in January of 2015. So this session, we're going to be going over the history of CCL's preferred policy solution. That's carbon fee and dividend. And we're also going to be talking about why a carbon price is so necessary. After that, we'll go over the bill that policy proposal turned into, which is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, or the Energy Innovation Act for short. And then lastly, we'll go over the legislative outlook for that bill before turning it over for some Q&A. So let's start with a quick review of where we are today. The price we consumers pay for fossil fuels is artificially low, and historically, governments have seen economic growth linked with incentivizing their development. Today, this is also due to several factors, including before production, fossil fuel producers receive discounted leases on public lands and offshore. During production, fossil fuel producers receive subsidies, special tax breaks, and eminent domain for pipelines. And after production, the price we pay for fossil fuels doesn't include some huge hidden costs. These hidden costs are known as externalities by economists, and some of them include the military. The US military has spent trillions protecting energy supply lines all over the world. Health. The use of coal alone increases healthcare costs $300 to $500 billion a year. And of course, environmental and climate costs. The costs associated with adapting to and mitigating the effects of a changing climate system are enormous. From disaster relief to crop insurance to flood prevention and seawalls, it's really a huge cost. If the market price for any product, not just fossil fuels, doesn't include its real costs, economists call that a market failure. And global warming has been called by some as the greatest market failure in the history of capitalism. Economists say the best first step to correcting a market failure is to hold a product accountable for its costs. With fossil fuels, this means moving those hidden costs we discussed earlier, from military expenditures, increased healthcare costs, environmental damages, and climate impacts, back onto the balance sheet of the fossil fuel producers. The idea of putting a price on carbon is simple. We add to the cost of doing business in those resources because we want to reveal the hidden costs that no one is taking responsibility for at present. Getting that price right means making the market tell the truth. It transforms our economy to move in the right direction, and that means ordinary people, consumers, small businesses, and taxpayers will recover the market leverage they are supposed to have to determine whether we do something that is too costly or not. In Citizens Climate Lobby, we emphasize that with all costs fully accounted for, then we let fossil fuels compete with other forms of energy in the marketplace. When consumers realize the true costs of burning fossil fuels, they will make more informed and better decisions, leading to a clean energy economy. And that all leads us to CCL's preferred way of making this happen, a carbon fee and dividend style solution. So let's start with a little history. Shortly after CCL was founded, CCL's founder, Marshall Saunders, heard world-renowned climate scientist James Hansen and several other policy analysts speak about carbon fee and dividend and how it was a practical, equitable, and bipartisan solution that needed more support in the field. Marshall was drawn to carbon fee and dividend for its simplicity, effectiveness, and opportunity for bipartisan support. It's always been one of CCL's core beliefs that to create lasting change, we need support from both sides of the aisle. So, in 2009, CCL started lobbying for carbon fee and dividend, and for the past 11 years, we have continued to believe that legislation modeled after carbon fee and dividend has the best chance of garnering bipartisan support while reducing a significant amount of emissions. So, what is carbon fee and dividend? It is a simple, effective policy proposal to put a price on carbon and reveal the hidden costs behind fossil fuels. The idea is to place an initial price per ton of CO2 in the first year and have that price rise each calendar year thereafter. The revenue generated by this carbon fee would not go to government programs, but rather be divided up evenly among US households. This protects Americans, especially those with lower income, from rising prices. Since everyone gets the same amount back, it creates an incentive to spend less on carbon-intensive goods. So take a family who is high income that takes multiple vacations a year, flying across the country, owns a large home that requires extensive heating and cooling, and buys lots of carbon-intensive goods. They would receive the same amount back in dividend as a family who takes family road trips rather than flying, commutes mainly through public transportation, and owns a smaller home that needs less AC and heating. The second family will end up with more money in their pocket after getting their dividend back because they spent less in the first place on carbon-intensive activities. This basic policy leads to reduced emissions, providing cleaner air and water, and saving lives across the country, and puts money into the pockets of Americans who in turn spend and create jobs not just in clean energy, but other sectors like retail and healthcare. So, after 9 years of lobbying for this proposal, it became actual introduced legislation in November of 2018 as the Energy Innovation Act. It was introduced by Democrat Representative Ted Deutsch and Republican Francis Rooney, both from Florida, in the House of Representatives. Shortly after, the Energy Innovation Act was introduced in the Senate by Democrat Senator Chris Coons and Republican Senator Jeff Flake. Since the 115th Congress ended in 2018, the Energy Innovation Act needed to be reintroduced in the 116th Congress, which started in January of 2019. It was reintroduced that January by Congressman Deutsch and Congressman Rooney and a handful of other original co-sponsors as H.R. 763, with that same title, the Energy Innovation Act. The bill has not been reintroduced in the Senate, as Senator Chris Coons is waiting for a Republican senator to join on before reintroducing. Let's get into the Energy Innovation Act. This bill was modeled after carbon fee and dividend, but it went from a one-page policy proposal to being a 48-page bill. However, it still uses the same basic principles, and we can boil it down to these talking points to easily explain how the bill works. So let's get to it. First, the bill puts a fee on carbon. The fee starts at $15 per ton and increases by $10 each year. All that money generated by the carbon fee is divided up evenly and given back to households as a monthly dividend check, one full share for each adult and one half share for each child. There are a couple other provisions that make this policy really work in today's political environment. There's the carbon border adjustment, which places a fee on imported goods coming into the US from other countries and gives a rebate on exported goods. This does two things. First, it makes sure that American companies can remain competitive with the rest of the world and removes any incentive of companies relocating jobs outside the US. Second, it incentivizes other countries to institute a carbon price equal or greater to the US so they don't have to pay the carbon border adjustment. The last main provision is a limited regulatory adjustment. So while the EPA would still be allowed to regulate greenhouse gases for air, water, and health standards, this provision would pause regulations on the global warming potential of greenhouse gases. This is to avoid doubling up on penalties and gives the policy a chance to meet ambitious targets while providing predictability to businesses so they can plan ahead. If the targets of the Energy Innovation Act aren't met, the regulatory pause is lifted, and EPA regulations would then be required to meet emission targets set by the Energy Innovation Act. So this bill meets our criteria for large-scale change through incentives that are fair to produce a healthier planet. So let's talk about why CCL really likes this bill. So the Energy Innovation Act is effective. This policy will reduce America's emissions by at least 40% within 12 years and by at least 90% by 2050. It's supported by economists and scientists as simple, comprehensive, and effective. It's also good for people. The carbon dividend puts money directly into people's pockets every month to spend as they see fit, helping low and middle income Americans. This policy will also improve health and save lives by reducing pollution that Americans breathe. Poor air quality causes an estimated 114,000 US deaths each year and sickens thousands more. This policy is also good for the economy. It will create 2.1 million additional jobs over the next 10 years, thanks to economic growth in local communities across America. This bill is also bipartisan. Representatives from both sides of the aisle are on board, co-sponsoring this bill together. The majority of Americans support Congress taking action on climate change. Solving climate change is too urgent to get caught up in partisan politics. And lastly, this bill is revenue neutral. The fees collected on carbon emissions will be allocated to all Americans to spend any way they choose. The government will not keep the fees collected so that the size of government will not grow. So now that we've all got that under our belt, let's talk about where the bill stands now. So as I said earlier, the Energy Innovation Act was reintroduced in January of 2019. Since the number of co-sponsors has climbed up to 81, including the original sponsors, which is huge, the carbon pricing bill with the next highest number of co-sponsors has 9 people signed on. So based on that, it's clear that this is the most popular carbon pricing method currently in Congress. So when a bill is introduced in Congress, it gets referred to whichever committees have jurisdiction over the language in the bill. In the case of the Energy Innovation Act, the committees that have jurisdiction are Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, and Foreign Affairs. A bill has to go through a hearing and markup process and pass through each committee is referred to. There haven't been any hearing or markups on the Energy Innovation Act this Congress, so that leads us to what our next steps are. Coronavirus has really shifted the legislative calendar this year and put a pause on a lot of different legislative activities. It does not seem likely that any of the committees of jurisdiction will hold hearings on major carbon pricing bills the rest of this year. So this means that the Energy Innovation Act will need to be reintroduced again next year at the start of the 117th Congress. And that's totally okay. CCL volunteers are pros at talking to their members of Congress about this bill and asking for co-sponsorship. So next year, we will continue on the quest for more co-sponsors, committee hearings, and eventually passing the Energy Innovation Act into law. I want to leave you with this quote from the late Marshall Saunders, CCL's founder. He said, "Constancy is my favorite virtue. So many people will go on for a little while and get excited for a year or two, but it's really constancy that gets things done." So it's been a long time since CCL started lobbying for carbon fee and dividend, and we still aren't done. We've got serious work to do to get the Energy Innovation Act signed into law, but I think we're all up for the challenge. So with that, we've got some time for questions from the chat that Kathy will go ahead and read out loud.
Hi, so we have a lot of questions in the chat, and unfortunately I have not been able to get to that many of them, but I'm going to try to group a few of them. And one of the questions that we've seen from a few different people, they'd like to know specifically what is being taxed. Is methane taxed? You know, what kinds of greenhouse gases are being taxed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So fossil fuels are being taxed based on their CO2 content. So this includes what you'd regularly think of: oil, natural gas, coal, but also hydrofluorocarbons, those really intense fossil fuels that have way more content of CO2 are also taxed. And since they're taxed at their rate of CO2, the higher concentration of CO2, the higher the tax is on that fuel. So I know that's kind of complicated, but if you really want to get into the math, you can look up what the content of CO2 is per ton and see what the price would be.
Okay, great. We have a question about how the regulatory pause would work, and if you could give a little more detail on that.
Yeah, of course. And this is really one of our most common questions that we get about the bill, so it's totally fair to ask about this. It also wasn't originally part of the carbon fee and dividend policy proposal, and one of the main reasons that this got introduced into the bill was to garner support from Republicans. And if you look, there's a handful of bipartisan carbon pricing bills in Congress right now, and any bill that's bipartisan on carbon pricing includes a regulatory adjustment. But I can definitely get into a little bit more and explain it. It's actually very narrow. So as I said in the presentation, it really only affects regulations on the global warming potential of greenhouse gases. So the EPA is still able to regulate fossil fuels for their effect on clean air, for their effect on clean water, for their effect on health. They're just not allowed to regulate for their global warming potentials. So things like CAFE standards are still in place, lots of other regulatory things are still in place. It's really just what would have been the Clean Power Plan, which was already replaced by the ACE rule by the Trump administration, and a few different permitting rules, that those would be affected. So that's how it works. And if after 10 years, the emission reduction targets set by the Energy Innovation Act, if those aren't being met, then that regulatory pause is lifted. So regulations can go back into effect, but not only can they go back into effect, that the language would actually be strengthened to require the EPA to make those emissions meet the Energy Innovation Act's targets, which is actually stronger regulatory legislation than has existed so far. So that's a quick explanation of that. There's a Sunday seminar on handling challenging questions about the Energy Innovation Act tomorrow. If you want to learn more about that, I would recommend joining that session as well.
Okay, several people have commented that, we call it a bipartisan bill, but we only have the one, Republican on it. And I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Yes, that is definitely fair. And, of course, we can be frustrated about that too. But one of the things that I really still consider this bill to be bipartisan is, although it just has Francis Rooney, the one Republican on it in the House, that this one polling company like Frank Luntz polling, who's a conservative pollster, has done polls looking at a solution of this type, and that especially young Republicans overwhelmingly support a solution like this. So while it is technically bipartisan in Congress because it has the one Republican co-sponsor, I think that you can really think of this legislation as being bipartisan in the support it receives, not just by members of Congress, but by the public, by other more right-leaning conservative environmental groups that support a policy like this. I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with the Climate Leadership Council, which is right of center and has a policy that they are proposing that's very similar to carbon fee and dividend. So totally fair to make that acknowledgement that there's only one Republican in Congress that's currently on the bill, but rest assured we're trying really hard to get more Republicans on, and I think we will.
All right, if you have time for one more, a few people in the chat have been asking about the border adjustment, how it works, and how it will protect U.S. companies.
Yeah, that's also something that comes up all the time. So the border adjustment, how it works is that if a country, even if they had a carbon price, but it was really small, it wouldn't be fair that the people in that country be able to make their products for much cheaper and then try to sell them in the US for that same cheaper price. And therefore, everyone would want to buy those products rather than the products from the US that are paying a carbon price. So to solve that problem, there is the carbon border adjustment where incoming goods would have to pay a tariff upon coming into the country that would set their price equal to what it would be if they were paying the carbon price in the US. So the whole point of the carbon border adjustment is to hopefully not even need to be used. The whole point is that it will make our trading partners really want to put in a carbon price in their country. And by putting that incentive on, we really hope that, and it looks likely that so many countries would want to put a carbon price in their country, and that way they wouldn't even have to pay the price, and it would also at the same time be protecting American companies and not letting American companies be incentivized to move jobs outside the US.
All right, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions in the chat that I don't think we're going to have time to get to, but I really recommend that everyone go to the forums where we have staff available to answer all the questions that we have not been able to get to.
Thanks, everyone.